Oh, we got another comment. People hate, this is interesting to the theory of humor. Some people hate our screwing up the intro. Like there's a comment on X where somebody's like, what? It's really interesting, actually. I don't know. I wonder why people get so pissed off about that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I don't know. All right.
Yeah.
This is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. I'm David Pietraszewski
I'm David Pinsoff, and this is Actual Evolutionary Psychology.
by actual evolutionary psychologist.
Enjoy.
David, I am really excited about this episode. Today we have two guests, Cristina Moya, who's a returner, who is a guest co-host, and our guest proper is Rob Boyd.
Yes, this was a really fun and interesting episode. Many tidbits about E. coli bacteria and Enola lizards, and anecdotes from evolutionary biology, mathematics. What was so interesting about this is there was some disagreements that we navigated. And we usually don't navigate too many disagreements on this podcast because Dave and I are optimally rational agents who cannot disagree on anything.
Yes, and
Per
to the
Allman's
extent
law.
that we
Yeah.
do we disagree, we quickly realize largely that we're just exploring the larger space that we would both agree about from different perspectives.
Yes, but Rob Boyd and Pete Richerson pioneered
Yeah.
the study of cultural evolution, the modeling of culture as its own kind of evolutionary process, and the story of how culture has been involved in the evolution of humanity and what role it has played uh, in our preeminence on this planet. And I think we're still trying to reconcile how this analysis of culture can be fit into the Darwinian paradigm or the evolutionary behavioral sciences. I think Dave and I are of the camp that it can be reconciled, that this view of cultural evolution is compatible with even the most extreme Santa Barbara evolutionary psychology model of the mind. And we try to explore that. But at the end of the day, there may still be some disagreements. And that's part of what makes science fun and awesome, is
Yeah.
that we get to disagree with each other and do some research and get to the bottom of it.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think this episode is a lovely example of Rob is incredibly brilliant. I mean, he is a giant whose shoulders we're all standing on, and a lot of what we take for granted, our generation, meaning like David and I's generation, is because of John. John and Lita and Rob and Joan and other folks like that. And I think Rob talked a lot. We talked also about that and just sort of the debates that were had in their generation were sort of necessary for coming to what you, me, and Christina's view is now, and not everybody agrees with us, but that's part of the fun. It's also a good example of not disagreeing to the point of vilifying, but do the opposite of like we're all friends, we can all be nice interpersonally, but still disagree or have debates. We should. That's the point of science.
yeah, absolutely. So it was a really fun time chatting with Rob and Christina about these big issues confronting the evolutionary social sciences and also the history of our field and how our field itself has evolved. I think you'll get a lot out of this conversation.
Yeah, enjoy. Rob, it's really great to see you. Thanks for being on. I wanted to start out by asking a simple question, which is when I think of you and Pete's and other people's work, the sort of not by genes alone expression. So the idea of sort of biological evolution and gene selection being adequate for an organism to be adapted or survive in an environment. My understanding is that one of the things that you did was to think about these other. selective regimes that are on top of genetic selection, like cultural selection, as a additional mechanism. Is it accurate to say that that's something that you and the people around you really initiated and plugged in? Where did that idea come from?
Um, we Pete and I got started in the mid 1970s, and it's hard to understand now, actually, or hard to behavioral ecology, game theory, evolutionary game theory was at best nascent. I mean, Hamilton had written these landmark papers in the 60s about kin selection, about senescence, about sexual, a bunch of stuff. And Maynard Smith had written, and Parker and some other people had written these, taken basically the very surface ideas of game theory and shown how they could be used to formalize the frequency dependent selection that arises when you have social interactions of various kinds. But I mean, the textbook, I went to graduate school in 1970, and the textbook that was the main textbook in ecology was by a guy named Eugene Odom, and it set out as its central premise that species evolve for the good of the species. And in the US, people just didn't think the same way that we do now about, I mean, if you want to call it individual advantage or gene-centered, there are various ways to think about it. And then in 1976, Wilson published Sociobiology, which had a huge impact, but was only sort of, I mean, he never really completely understood, in my view, modern evolutionary theory. He kind of understood it, but, he was still rooted, I think, in to some degree in the older ethological, Tinbergen style picture of things. Now, things were somewhat different in Great Britain, where people were more centered in the modern way of thinking about things. Anyway, and then Dick Alexander, sort of, I think of Dick and Wilson as kind of the fathers of American, anyway, evolutionary thinking. And Dick wrote this long paper in the Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics. And unlike Wilson, it was completely rooted in the new way of thinking. And was also full. I mean, Wilson famously had this last chapter where he said this is all going to change the social sciences, but it was kind of vague. And whereas Alexander got down to cases, and I don't know if you ever met Dick, but he was kind of a dark character in some ways, but very insightful guy. And the paper is just full of intriguing ideas about human evolution. So people did the obvious thing. They started thinking, how can we explain human evolution in evolutionary terms? And there's a lot of enthusiasm. And both Pete and I, our initial reaction is yes, but it doesn't, it's not enough. That people are as different from other vertebrates as multicellular organisms are from single cell. I mean, and so anyway, that's why we started thinking about this. And so from the start, our idea was to try to understand. I mean, the obvious difference is different groups of people behave differently. It must have something to do with non-genetic transmission. Try to build a theory where that's something that could be favored by natural selection and at the same time lead to divergent results. And Mark Feldman and Luca Cavalli-Sforza had written this book, well, not a book yet, there's a bunch of papers in the early and mid 70s showing how you could use population genetic ideas from population genetics theories to think about cultural transmission. They were not interested in the same questions we were. Mark has been and still is very interested in genes and IQ and trying to make proper inferences from phenotypic variation, amongst families and stuff. and only much later became interested in what I think of as the adaptationist questions, really not until the late 80s and 90s. But we were greatly benefited by what they taught basically in these papers about how you could use ideas from population genetics. And in our 84 book, I think what we mainly added was, well, two things: a bunch of ideas about directional processes that would lead to culturally mediated adaptation. Because it's got to be, whatever it is, besides making things different, if it evolved, the system has to be adaptive. The psychology has to pay. And also, I think the thing that we did that made people take notice was we said, okay, but yeah, how can you make a system like that evolve from an organism that doesn't have a system like that? How can it produce fitness benefits? And then, of course, we're interested, and at the same time, you know, lead to all the weird things that people do.
Mm.
So we got started because we were interested in that question,
Yeah.
and we just kept plugging away.
Was the were the tools that was in the water that was new? Was it this frequency dependent, the game theory or ESS analysis? And then that was that was sort of the idea that was those were the tools. Is that correct? Or what would you say were the
Well, I think that was, you needed those tools to do a proper job of asking what natural selection would do. I mean, you're making lots of simplifications like usual, but
yeah.
what Cavalli, Sforza, and Feldman added, and we added, was seeing that once you have sufficiently accurate social learning, however that works, it creates another system which carries information through time, creates history. And in most organisms, I mean, there are a bunch of things. There's succession and all this extended evolutionary synthesis stuff. So Pete was raised on a farm, and he likes farming examples. And if you think about transmitting farms, that's a kind of example of how you have non-genetic transmission. If you inherit a farm, the behaviors that are good for you, everything else is different than if you don't inherit a farm. But farms can't spread the way the idea about how to farm can spread, because energetically small things, knowing when to plant and knowing how to fertilize and stuff like that, they can spread extremely rapidly because they don't, the information itself doesn't count for much. So I think personally, I think that's what makes culture different than other forms of, I mean, fins are a good example, that how you get from fins to legs, knowing something about development and knowing something about homeobox genes and all these things that encode developmental rules gives you a lot of purchase and understanding. So the story of Tiktaalik, I think it's still the oldest land vertebrate, and this guy whose work I'm what's his name? Your inner fish. I can't remember his name. This is the hazard of old age. But anyway,
I can't remember anything from yesterday. So,
my proper noun module is
yeah.
failing on me. But so if you look at in vertebrates, the land vertebrates, you get one bone in the upper arm, two bones in the next length, and then all kinds of little bones. You don't get any of that in fish. You just get this. And the question is, how do you get from fish to land vertebrates? And
right.
this guy, whose name I will remember eventually, he's a paleontologist. He worked up in North Greenland on these sediments that had 500 million year old, no, that's not right. Must be more like 300 million year old. Anyway, early land vertebrates. And he found these forelimbs of these early fishy land vertebrates. And to understand how you got there from fins, you really do need to understand well, I don't know if you need, but it's immensely, it makes it much easier to understand what happens if you understand how limb development
Right.
works.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the phenotypic gambit gets you why these organisms needed rigid forelimbs and a
Right.
bunch of other stuff, but it doesn't tell you why they're built the way they are.
Yeah.
And
No, 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 for sure. It's not the whole
yeah,
picture, and it's not
yeah,
satisfying for explaining which part of organism space to use the Dawkins
exactly.
terms. Yeah, yeah,
It's
exactly.
yeah, evolution is
Yeah,
depends on where the variation is,
yeah,
and the phenotypic gambit just essentially says, I don't know about that, so I'm not
yeah,
going to worry about
exactly.
it.
And I think this is actually something Christina and I have talked a lot about over the decades, that also, you simplify what's not relevant for your particular um,
Right,
goals, right?
right,
And I think, and one of the other things too is, obviously I was a student of Lita Cosby's and John Tooby,
yeah,
and I know there was a history of, it was sort of love and conflict in the sense of you both had, there were similar missions of evolutionizing the human behavioral sciences, using
yeah.
evolution to understand human behavior. But then there was, and I know, Rob, you and I have had conversations over the years too. Uh,
And
yeah, I mean, maybe
Christina,
the, what, yeah, and Christina, no,
and
of course, and
Christina.
yeah, and Christina, no, exactly. I mean, I don't even know where to start with that. I don't know if I even have a question, but like that might lead into,
Yeah, I
what,
think
yeah,
the contrast, I think, is useful. I mean, and I wouldn't have said was. Lita's still around and right,
yeah,
still
yeah.
working. Is that
Oh yeah,
right?
no,
I haven't.
Lita, yes, of
Yeah,
course. Yeah,
yeah,
no, Lita's, yeah,
yeah. And we spent 6 months together at an institute in Germany, and I would say we're friends, but or were with John, and but definitely pretty deep disagreements about how to think about both evolution and then about human evolution in particular. My evolution training came uh, at UC Davis, which in those days was the heartland of selectionist biology. And then I did a postdoc at the University of Chicago, where there was a renaissance. It didn't last that long, but in quantitative genetics and genetics of characters that are affected by genes at many loci. And I would say that John and I had real disagreements about, forget about culture, about how evolution worked. And I mean, I still think I'm right or was right, but I'm sure he thought the same. Uh, he had a very Fisherian view of, and I don't really know. I never talked to Lita about this very much, but selection being acting on dragging genes slowly, and he put a lot of emphasis on species as a real thing. I think they're at best an abstraction, and the picture of evolution that I think is correct is that most evolution, now this isn't always true. Sometimes it does work in a Fisherian way, but it's working on standing variation. So I don't know if you take so I mean there's been a lot of water under the bridge since, but um, so this guy John Losos, I don't know if you know his work at all. He works on anoles in the Caribbean, and um, so it turns out that on each of the Caribbean islands, there are a whole community of these lizards, anolis lizards. And there's big ones that live in the top of the trees and little skinny ones that run along branches and other ones that hold, and they've got typical phenotypic, these are mainly morphological color differences. And none of these guys on the different islands are related. On each island, these morphs evolved from some generalists that made it to the island and then differentiated into all these things. Okay, not so radical already. They've done experiments where Loso says, and there's lots of work like this now, where they introduce lizards to islands with no lizards. And within 5 years, you begin to see these species first track. The ones that run the little branches end up having shorter legs, and the ones that live higher up in the trees have longer legs. But 5 years, this isn't new mutations happening, being dragged slowly across to fixation. This is taking standing variation that affects morphology and rapidly shifting. And there's lots and lots of examples like this. Coloration in deer mice, um, coloration in guppies, life history variables in guppies. So you can, so in guppies, there are these rivers in Trinidad where all this work has been done. And as you go up the river, eventually you get to a pond above a waterfall where there are no predators. And the guppies up there have slow life histories, and the guppies just below the waterfall have fast life histories, right? Because they got to get going before they get eaten. And so this guy, Dave Resnick, who's at Riverside, put various predators, 2 different kinds of predators, in these things above the things. And within 3 or 4 years, you've got faster life histories. And
so can I ask if
yeah,
if the implication of this difference in thinking is that evolution can happen much quicker if it's acting on standing variation, but is it also something about the nature of the variation, like that these are something like packages of traits, something going back a little bit to the phenotype, the
maybe. I
problems with
don't,
the phenotypic gambit,
yeah,
uh,
I don't,
there will, yeah, are there constraints that you think are important to consider or no?
there are, I'm certain, but I don't think we know what they are. I think, so Resnick also, I mean, so these are all pretty simple changes, although life history, I don't think we really understand exactly what's going on there. But he did in the same genus as guppies, but not guppies. He worked on the evolution of live birth. So a lot of fish have live birth. They retain the eggs inside their bodies. The little developing embryos feed on the yolk, and then they have live birth. That's not such a big deal. But there are 3 species in this genus that have evolved placentas, basically. So they lay eggs with hardly any yolk, and then they have an organ that is not like our placenta particularly. It's designed differently, but still, it's a complex organ whose job it is to provide nutrients to these little developing embryos that don't have any yolk to eat. And at a minimum, they've evolved. Those have evolved in 250,000 years in one of the species, maybe 1 million in the other 2, and that's a minimum. That's from the last common ancestor that doesn't have this trait. So I don't think we really know about the evolution of, I mean, simple things like morphology, we know for sure that can evolve fast. And it evolves fast not because it's one gene. It evolves fast because it's many genes, each with small effect. So milk yield, you make a wolf into a Pekingese in hardly any time at all. And I don't think we know about, but I do think it makes you think twice about the EEA and that our mind or our brain is a series of modules that were designed to deal with things 10,000 years ago and haven't changed since. I actually think this is a problem that, so my colleague here, Kevin Langergraber, has argued that chimps have menopause. And that's hugely controversial right this second, and people argue back and forth. I don't want to get in the middle of that one. But menopause, people have measured the heritability of menopause. I had a student a long time ago, Jocelyn Pache. You knew Jocelyn, didn't you?
No, it was before my time,
before
but
your time.
yeah.
She measured the heritability of menopause about 0.3, and there were some problems with her work, but it's been done twice since, and estimates are about the same. So what that tells you is if there were a selected, so now you have peasant populations, agricultural populations, where women could keep having kids. Why aren't they keep having kids? And the selective advantage ought to be pretty big. You could move menopause. This is the age of menopause, which in most populations is around 50, pretty easily in a few thousand years. Not even that. And we know 1,000 years, well, we know historical evidence, let's say, that suggests it hasn't changed much in the age of menopause in 2,000 years. Now, that's not very good data, but so anyway, I think I don't have an answer to this question. In the end, I'm more of a agnostic about these things than Lita and John were. And
So
yeah, go ahead.
maybe like one of their arguments would be, or maybe not them. I don't know. I've seen Ed Hagen recently, like
Yeah,
talk
Ed's a
some of
good foil because he's so smart.
he's he's so careful, right?
Yeah.
And my understanding of some of their argument is that um, complex adaptations, which is, what
Yeah.
is a complex adaptation? Because like now we're talking about, quantitative traits that have
Yeah.
multiple
Yeah.
loci,
Yeah. Yeah.
multiple phenotypes, but that, um, I guess not, it's not arguable to say that the human brain is a complex adaptation, but there might be differences. Obviously, there's genetic variation in various
Yeah.
cognitive
Yeah. Yeah.
propensities.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I'm sure memory is, I'm sure so many things
Yeah.
are
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
what isn't. Um, but that like the fundamental kind of questions about human cognition that are like more species typical are unlikely to have changed as much in the last, I don't know, 10,000 years or something like that. What do you make? I guess obviously it can't be any kind of um, categorical break in terms of what has and hasn't changed, but I guess there is, there's the equivalent of biological anthropologists who look at kind of lumbar morphology and
Hmm.
bipedalism and how it kind of works generally in
Yeah.
humans. And I guess maybe their argument, but you guys might represent it better, would be something like there's the equivalent attempt at doing something like that for the human mind.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think, there are things like lumbar morphology that are species typical in humans, but there's a lot of other stuff that's, family typical and I don't think, uh, how much of that, what's a
yeah, what is a
constraint?
species also? But
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I know
I'm
I'm
very,
tangent off.
very, you know, living as I am, living amongst paleoanthropologists these days.
It's a
No,
mess. Yeah.
well,
It's a branch. Yeah, it's a branch. Yeah.
the director of the Institute of Human Origins, Johannes Haile Selassie, has just published in Nature a few weeks ago this species of Australopithecus deridimata. When he first published it, I thought, oh, come on, is that really that different? Is that how the heck do we know? Living at exactly the same time as Afarensis. And now he's got pretty good evidence that it had a significantly different mode of locomotion, that it had
Hmm.
a opposable, semi-opposable toe and much longer arms. And, is that a species? All dogs are the same species, right? But if people found those fossils in the fossil record, actually, this goes back to a story when Lyell visited Darwin in the mid 1850s, and Darwin was a pigeon. He kept pigeons and people had bred all these, just as diverse as dogs, basically. And Lyell said, you know, shuddered that this basically wrecked everything, because if we found these pigeons in the fossil record, they'd be different
Mm.
families, and
Mm.
more from based on their morphology. So,
Mm.
so I don't
Yeah.
know
As
how
a
I
very
got there
short,
exactly.
as a very short person, oftentimes like with towering people around me, I think paleontologists would have surely classified as different species. But I'm not enough of a paleontologist to know. I
Yeah,
mean, maybe if they only got like my humerus or something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Joan says that if you don't know David Jones about the same height as Cristina, roughly, don't you think,
I
Cristina?
think maybe she
Yeah.
has an inch on me, so I'm 4'11".
Oh, she's 5 feet. Yeah.
Those inches really make, yeah,
So she claims 5 feet. And she says all people are tall. I can't tell a difference
yeah,
between. So anyway.
that's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Okay, so I don't know about John and Lita. I mean,
Yeah.
their method required them that there were these modules, and by looking at contemporary behaviors, because they were the result of modules or some kind of I know you've written about modules,
Yeah,
Dave,
but I mean, it
but
doesn't
I
matter.
don't mean
Yeah.
modules in
No,
that
no, I know you
technical
don't. Yeah, yeah,
psychological
exactly.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But that you could map particular input-output relations back to some problem in the Pleistocene. If you can't do that, you got problems, right? And I'm skeptical about that. And and I'll rat
So,
Pete out here. Pete and I have ferocious arguments about this. Basically, he thinks there are no modules, and he bases this on he's read a lot more than I have of neurobiology. And there was a paper in Nature, some Nature reviews a year or two ago, which argued basically human brains just have more of the same. They're just chimp brains with more of everything and no special features. I have no idea how to evaluate those kind of arguments. And so I say, Pete, what about birds' nests? What about, beaver dams? Those look like modules to me. And, beavers, I've read quite a bit about beavers and little beavers. So beavers live in ponds where everybody behind the dam is fairly closely related. The ecologists that have studied them, the averages are like 0.3 or 0.4 or something like that. So, and, that's pretty impressive actually. But when the little beavers leave, they disperse, and beavers build different kinds of structures in different kinds of aquatic environments. Sometimes they build little canals back to a pond they make for themselves. Sometimes they just build lodges on the side of streams. Sometimes they build dams. They build dams in different ways, depending on how much water pressure there is. And those little beavers seem to know how to do that without ever having seen a dam being built. There's no social learning involved. And the same thing is true of birds' nests. So weaver birds, people have raised weaver birds without any exposure to nest building, and they build. Now they don't there is learning involved. So the first nest a weaver bird built is not as good as the second nest that he builds. And they are all, the males are building the nest. So he is okay. But so there's some kind of information encoded in weaver bird brains and in beaver brains that tells them how to build a nest. And so that makes me skeptical of the neurobiological arguments. And I can't convince Pete. He's really gone over to the everything is plastic kind of picture, and it's based on, he's not stupid. He doesn't think it's a blank slate, but he thinks there are these general motivational and embodied principles, and then that's where all the details come from. And I don't know. So I just know that I'm not convinced that anybody knows the answer to that. So
Do you think it's like an ontogenetic phylogenetic distinction? Like, I mean, do you think that people are saying it's just more of they're looking at the ontogeny and then the sort of to be really glossy about it, like John and Lida are thinking about sort of the phylogenetic design on the developmental systems to kind of bring it back to what we talked about before, but they weren't emphasizing that because they weren't studying the developmental system.
yeah, I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, every time I read neurobiology, I think, they don't know what they're talking about, but at the same time, they know a huge amount of stuff. And so I don't know. I just don't, I never have had enough background or ambition to really, and I don't think my own guess is, I mean, I bet my career on this kind of, that it's not there yet. They don't know enough to know how it all works, and firm conclusions one way or the other
Yeah.
are dubious. But
Yeah, I remember Randy Gallistel gave his talk because he's got that Gallistel, and I can't think of the other person's name because I can't think of nouns either. But they've got this book about, memory requires addressable read-write format,
yeah,
and neural conductance changes doesn't buy you that. And I remember he gave a talk at Yale when I was a postdoc, and he gave the talk in front of the neuroscientists at Yale, and he gave this like hour-long
yeah,
talk,
and
and
they
then
went crazy.
and actually, he was like, nobody had a good answer. And really,
Yeah, yeah.
when it came down to it, literally, one of the people said, yeah, but it's hard. So yeah, so I think your career is fine, Rob. I think they don't know. I
I
mean, we don't know. No, we don't know anything. None of us know how this stuff works. It's
I will tell you a Randy Galstel anecdote, which is on the same theme. So I was at a conference in Paris, and I was sitting next to Randy, who has a wicked sense of humor, and and it's kind of a contrary, And so this guy was giving this, it was kind of a typical um, neurobiology talk. He was an anatomist, and he was, this kind of like the old song, the thigh bones connected to the neck bones. So they have all these circuits in the brain, and different pieces are connected. And he had done a whole bunch of fancy work to learn how, information, we presume, is being transmitted between these uh, anatomically different parts of the brain. And so somebody, and I don't know who, raised their hand and said, can you explain how the information that's transmitted along these circuits is encoded? And Randy leaned over to me and he said, now, a glimpse into the abyss. And and so, and the guy had no answer. I said, we have no idea.
Yeah.
And no, this is 20 years ago, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at least it was an honest answer. Yeah. No, I mean, and that's, yeah, I think that's, I mean, I appreciate that about all of us here is, if you don't know, it's a good thing to, didn't you say, Rob, I feel like this is a story you told about John Maynard Smith where somebody said something, oh, you changed your mind once. And he said, of course I did. I knew the data. Like, is that,
no, I don't know that
yeah.
story.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I think, yeah, thinking that, feeling like you have to know something is a curse of the academy.
Yeah. No, he was, John is my intellectual hero, and he was an honest guy that way.
Did you know him?
Um, kind of. I met him at various conferences, and then we got invited to this. Both got invited to this. It's in Steyr, Austria. Every year they have a kind of a school on some topic, and I got invited to give a bunch of lectures on, and they invite a bunch of students for a week, and then the last day a bunch of big shots show up, and so I wasn't a very big shot, but they talked me into giving lectures about game theory and kin selection to all these students. 4 days, hour and a half lecture every day, and so I get there, and who's in the audience but John Maynard Smith? Holy crap! And so unlike the other big shots, he showed up the first day, listened to the whole thing, talked to the students. He was great, and it turned out that, like me, he's an early riser. So, at 6:30 every morning, he and I were there at the beginning of the line to get breakfast, and so I had breakfast with him every morning for a week. And I hung out with him. We got to be, we were hanging out together a lot.
Yeah.
And then I met him some other times. And I mean, he was a prickly guy, but I thought great. And not a modest fellow, but I don't think he probably had good reason not to be modest.
No,
That,
exactly.
that is true. I want to see if I could. So it'll probably be of interest to our listeners to see if we could really nail down on what the disagreements are between you and Lita and John. So in
Yeah.
discussing these differences about how evolution works,
You're
you
going to really make
mentioned
me fess up here now, but okay, sorry.
no. No, I think
Back to Maynard
it's
Smith.
important
Yeah.
for us to get a handle on
Yeah.
precisely what the disagreements are and whether they even exist. Because I think there are some people who think that we can all just get along, and these disagreements are just kind of narcissism of petty differences.
Well, they may
To
be
put it,
that, but
they may be that, yeah. But so in talking about your differences between Lita and John, you mentioned rapid evolutionary change and guppies and lizards. You talked about the evolution of menopause, how it has surprisingly low heritability, and how there may have been
no,
constraints.
surprisingly high heritability.
Oh, you think? Okay. Regardless,
Point three means that if you get a 1 standard deviation change due to selection, you get a 3/10 of a standard deviation change per generation. Do the
got it.
math. You get.
Yeah, that's true.
Uh,
But nevertheless, I believe the suggestion was that there could have been selection for increased menopause in recent human evolutionary history. But the fact that we didn't see that suggests that there's some kind of constraint to adaptiveness. Is that
no,
basically no?
or that for some reason, a 50-year-old menopause is fitness maximized.
Okay. All right. I'm still trying to nail down what the disagreement is then. Is it just that there's been more recent evolution than perhaps Toobie and Cosmides think, that maybe the EEA is more recent than they might have thought? Or is the point that there are constraints on optimality that limit the utility of adaptationist analysis? What is
No.
I
I
want
mean,
to
I
drill
think
down.
all this is secondary. Uh,
Okay.
um, uh, the real disagreement between John, Lita, Pete, and I is, I think, about um, cultural evolution and its role in explaining behavior. Pete and I think that, well, to put it as bluntly as possible, that in humans, selection has favored a psychology that does stuff, that causes people to do stuff that they see people around them doing, even though they have no adaptive reason to think that's the correct thing to do.
Right.
And I've got models, of course, that show that's possible. Now that's, why maybe, as Pete's kid used to say. And philosophers talk about why possibly, that's what models, but I like why maybe better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've talked to John about this. I had never talked to Lita about this, but he thought that was impossible, that our psychology couldn't be built in a way that you would learn to be celibate, or you would learn to risk your life climbing mountains, or you would learn, all those things would have to arise from motivations and information processing that would have been favored by selection in a hunter-gatherer existence. Small bubble bands, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that's wrong, that selection has created a psychology that causes us to be susceptible to the social environment, informational environment in which we live. And because it's so, social learning is a two-edged sword. It gives us immense adaptive power, much greater adaptive power than any other vertebrate. Since now I'm giving a speech, but I'll give the speech anyway. The 50,000 years ago, modern humans, or 60 or so, it depends who you listen to, emerged from Africa, and they spread across the world in a few thousand years. So this is a tropical forager living in warm environments with a particular mix of adaptations that are necessary. And it looks like within a few thousand years, they're living north of the Arctic Circle. and in which the suite of adaptations necessary to make a living is immensely different. And you need clothing, you need housing, you need all kinds of stuff. And this people were able to acquire all these adaptations for all the different parts of the world they lived in because they could evolve culturally and acquire. So it's not individual humans that adapt. Human populations adapt because they can share information, and it only works if you adopt adaptations that you don't understand why they're the way they are.
Right.
You know,
Credulity, yeah, like the kayak design is a
so
great
you have
example.
to be
Yeah.
credulous.
Yeah.
And what you get for that is this huge adaptive machine that gives you things that individual cognition, as smart as we are, is grotesquely underpowered to acquire. And but that means that you're prone to picking up ideas that, aren't that sensible sometimes. And so I think it's like lots of stuff in evolution. There's a trade-off. There's a trade-off between having cultural adaptation, and I'll say just as an aside, David, I think selection's important, but so are non-selective processes. So cultural selection is only part of the story. I mean, transformative processes like Sperber and all those guys are for sure important. And and we can talk about that if you want. But so, and I think, I mean, maybe I'm caricaturing John and Lita, but I think, and I've talked more to John about this than Lita. He just thought that was nonsense. That people were smart. They had all these domain-specific adaptations, and
it seems like, though, that there's a compatibility between the two views. The only disagreement that I can pick up on is on the extent of credulity about this cultural information. But it seems like you could get that kind of cultural adaptation with a fair amount of credulity and a fair amount of scrutiny of the different cultural variants and a fair amount of sensitivity to, say, the success of a particular hunting practice or a particular person who's adopting that practice or the particular social benefits. All of these, the psychology could be sensitive to all of these variables, and you could still get this cultural adaptation. And in fact, it could even facilitate this cultural adaptation if you have these psychological sensitivities.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, this is, what people say about scientific theories. The first reaction is, well, that's complete nonsense. How could that possibly be? The second reaction is, well, maybe under particular circumstances. And the third reaction is, that's what we thought all along. Exactly. Maybe.
I think maybe there's a sociological point here to make, which is that, like, I think for the point of showing the novelty and of being able to make new predictions, I think cultural evolutionists have often pointed to really amazing things that are weird in humans, like you mentioned celibacy, like sacrificing, or and kind of the in group. And I do bet that, like, some people don't think that that's, there are different explanation. People propose different explanations for those extreme examples. But I think that that has maybe sometimes lend it to be characterized as like people are dumb perspective, or that like like that's the extreme level of credulity, right? Like that is the most credulous.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so if you think people are endowed with so the thing is, well, I mean, celibacy is an interesting one because people obviously like sex, right? And so the question is, how could it be? I mean, I've not just from John and Lita, I mean, Dick Alexander and all those people. Come on, I mean,
try to find an adaptation, like
people know what they're doing right now that it's and the thing is, selection can't, in my view, selection can't endow us with, have sex no matter what,
Yeah.
because there are always trade-offs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to take an example, in the Maasai, um, young men, Moran E, are the warriors were supposed to be celibate. And when they graduated from that age set, then they could get married and have sex. And of course, big surprise, sometimes they had sex, but as Morani, not as seniors. But it was costly, right? There were norms in place that people impose costs, and so people, sure, they like sex, but they're also sensitive to,
Yeah.
uh, and so where do the norms come from? The norms
Yeah.
on John and Lita's account, I would say, have to come from some module somewhere.
Yeah.
And on my account, they can evolve all over the place because we don't know. We're not very good at figuring out how society should be organized. That's another thing we don't understand very well. I mean, I've argued sort of endlessly that selection of cultural differences between groups is one force that shapes norms. I am surely that can't be the only thing. It doesn't explain a lot of change. It's too slow. There are a lot of reasons why it can't be the only main process. And I don't think we're very good at there's some papers by Lehman and Powers and some other people about bargaining. I think there are problems with that way of looking at it, but I think within group processes must be important. And so we got to figure that out. But I think that the fact that these things are heritable at the group level, meaning that groups persist, you shift environments and they'll shift eventually, but it often is quite slow, and you can predict a lot about what people's norms are from what language they speak. And all these things are not the signatures of a universal psychology mapping environment, meaning the ecological, physical environment, onto social behavior. There's some history, and if evolutionary psychologists want to say that's what we believe, fine. I've won.
Yeah,
but
exactly. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh,
And I think that's right. I mean, to just put it like, like Christina and I have these conversations. I think I like, I wonder when you and John were talking, I think we're hindsight is 2020. And I think we wouldn't have the understanding we have if you and John hadn't had that debate. But I mean, one thing I appreciate as a John Lita student was, the kayak example where you don't just to caricature the John and Lita my training would be sort of there's no account of kayak design, right, in the mind, right? That you have to explain that complexity and that adaptation and why that kayak does so well. And what I like about this,
or bicycle.
yeah, or bicycle or anything, exactly. Yes, I prefer bikes, as we know. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
exactly.
Both Rob and I are cyclists. But yeah, no, I mean, I like that there's an extra thing to explain, which is this shorter time span, the trial and error. Everything is trial and error. You just don't see the error all the time, but it's, just variance in the world, and
Yeah.
there's selective retention of variation in the design. And I think, Christina and I, my feeling is that now evolutionary psychologists are often thinking about like what's the EEA of the class of things that are like kayak design, exactly in the way that David's talking about it, where there are entries for I'm going to accept something with credulity, right? Um, because this has been an aspect
Yeah.
that has
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
recurrently been. So I actually think I believe we've come to completely both being integrated, but I think we couldn't have gotten there if you guys hadn't had that argument because I do think it was missing. I will say that as a student of John Alito, like I do think that the extra, I mean, I think the idea was there. I mean, the To Be Devore paper had that idea, but I do think it was emphasized, and I do think we needed to have that argument. Maybe that's my Buffalo, everybody can get along upbringing, but that's my opinion. That's my 2 cents about it. I don't know what Christina thinks about it.
I think that there's a method. I'm not, we've been skirting around like the methodological difficulty of it. I mean, I generally agree that they're compatible, Rob, for what it's worth. And I don't, and maybe historically they weren't. Um, but there's a methodological difficulty as well in like parsing out, no, if we all agree that the kayak isn't the EEA, but there's like a
No
kayak set of
module.
things.
Yeah.
There's no kayak module, but there's maybe is like, there has to be a cognition that's capable of accepting and processing kayak-like
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what is the category of kayak-like things? The difficulty is that like I'm not sure that the kayak is a good, or bicycle is a good example of that because we know it's like technological evolutionary history. But things like kinship structures or social
Yeah.
systems, we have no idea. And then it
Mm.
becomes, I think, a much harder process of like disentangling of like, well, is the reason that we have these kinds of like intuitions about kinship or about um I don't know,
Mm.
maybe reciprocity or maybe about
Yeah.
fatherhood, like is that like a kayak
I
that
see. Yeah. So
that we
you're,
just don't
yeah.
have like the historical knowledge of when this kind of fatherhood institution or this social system evolved, or is that really a deep-seated part
Mm.
of human cognition?
Well, I
That
mean,
we want to be
kinship, we
typical.
know that there's a lot of cultural variation in
Exactly,
kinship, yeah.
exactly. Right.
And we've got some idea of the timescales on which um, those systems
I guess
evolve.
with like
So
phylogenetic kind of
from Ruth
approaches
Mace
or
kind of
something.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, throughout Western Central Australia, all the dry bits basically, people had these incredibly complicated 8-section kinship systems. Do you guys know about
Yeah.
those?
They're
Yeah,
great.
Christina knows. She's a
You
real
have to teach
anthropologist.
it.
Yeah, exactly. And I tried to learn that. It's really
That's so hard.
complicated. and, that's evolved on something like 10,000 year timescales, right?
Oh, I didn't know that part. Okay.
Well, we know from the geographical extent, I think,
Yeah.
that and linguistic correlation. That we
Right.
don't really know, but I mean, it's not like bicycles. It's not the last 100 years.
Right. Right.
And kayaks. We don't really know. I mean, I wish we did, but
Okay.
the history of kayaks. There's some toy kayaks from about 4,000 years ago. They look like the modern ones, and that's about all we have. And then some that are a few hundred years old. So we don't really know very much about the time scale. And surprisingly, people on the north coast of Asia and Kamchatka and places like that, which you'd think present pretty similar ecological problems. They do build skin boats, but they're really crude compared to the skin boats that people in North America. So I wish we knew more about that. And the only good examples I think we really have are pretty recent things. There's this guy whose name I forget again. Sorry, English guy who studies the evolution of looms in East Asia. Uh, they're fantastic. He really understands the history and the phylogenetic patterns, and there's a bunch of horizontal transmission, which makes, I mean, horizontal not in the between group transmission of ideas. And anyway, so I don't think we know
But I guess what
about.
I was trying to argue, Rob, is that like we know that we have good reason to believe that like 50,000 years ago we didn't have kayaks everywhere.
I
Um,
don't buy that.
you
Uh,
really? Okay, okay,
no,
that's
I
interesting.
don't buy that at all.
So there
Uh,
could have been like we could have. I mean, I know there's debate about like Neanderthals also doing some level of like seafaring,
well,
or
I think the evidence for seafaring, and the first people who got to actually, of all people, Kristen Hawkes has a paper,
Mm.
Kristen and Jim O'Connell. Quite good, I think, for my taste, quite good evidence that the earliest settlers of Australia had ocean-going boats.
Oh wow, okay. Well, that's
Um,
not popping my
they
ball.
get this from the settlement of offshore islands, which
Mm.
are which would have been, you know, 50 or 100 kilometers.
So maybe there is a kayak module.
No, but they weren't the same boats.
Yeah,
All the details about how to make the kayak,
no, I agree.
there may be some boat module, possibly. I'm skeptical,
I'm
actually,
skeptical.
but
Yeah.
uh,
Right.
but
But more plausibly, there are folk physics modules. I mean, I don't like the term module, but there are systems that
well,
have
whatever. I don't.
intuitions or
Yeah, whatever.
expectations about the physical world and how physical
Surely there
objects
are.
interact.
Yeah,
Surely there are
yeah,
probably folk engineering or tool use modules where we have a concept of what a tool is and that it has a
maybe.
specific function.
That's what
Um,
this guy Osiriak, this French guy. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
yeah, no, and Clark Barrett has argued this in his book
Yeah,
The Shape of Thought. So it seems to me that even the extreme Santa Barbara school picture of the mind, which is filled with these context sensitive, specialized modules, right, is totally compatible with cultural evolution and cultural adaptation. Oh, do you see any kind of incompatibility there? Because it seems like those two pictures of the mind could both be true. We could both have really sophisticated minds with complex, specialized adaptations, and we could have cultural evolution and
absolutely.
culturally adaptive
Yeah,
processes at the same time. And it may even be the case that the two complement each other, that you're more likely to get cultural evolution in a more adaptive direction if you have the sophisticated mind to
yeah.
evaluate the different outputs of culture.
But then you can't. Yes, I agree with everything you just said.
Okay.
Um, but that's not what John and Lita said.
Okay.
Uh, they wanted to go from stories about that's pejorative. I shouldn't say that. They wanted to go from hypotheses about life in mobile foraging bands in the late Pleistocene and make inferences about how people should behave now. And that means that there's a direct correspondence between some adaptive, I mean, I'm quoting them now almost, some adaptive problem that people faced in these Pleistocene societies and how behaviors expressed now in response to cues that people get.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's true to some extent. I mean, but I also think there's a huge range of behavior, which
Oh, sure.
that doesn't
Yeah.
help you with. But John, I think, thought that got you the whole package.
I
Yeah.
mean,
And
it could well get you the hope. Like, what if some of those modules involve evaluating potential tools or potential foraging strategies or potential social norms in terms of whether they advocate for one's interests or
yeah, but
thwart
they don't
one's
tell you what the
interests?
norm or the tool should be like.
Correct, they don't, but they
And
could
John thought they did.
nevertheless.
Right. I think
Yeah,
that's
that's
the,
true.
yeah.
That's the key difference, right? But it seems like if we're assuming that they don't tell you the content of the norms or the content of the tool, then it seems like they're entirely compatible
Well,
perspectives that you could, yeah,
yeah, but
yeah,
we got to fill in the details.
right,
And,
yeah,
And I
Yeah.
and
guess
I don't
I
think we're
think
very close to that,
Yeah. And I think
actually. But
Christina's
yeah,
point, I mean, just want to echo Christina's point. It also then means that there is this issue of at what level of abstraction. And the concern would be that you're looking at something that, so just to be clear, like we were talking about, like where does the evolved psychology end and where does the information stored in the environment begin? And
in,
Christina's point, if I understood it, was that it's hard to know, and there may be cases where we think something is so well designed that we're really looking at it as like this is something that's in the phenotype that's
Mhm.
reliably developing, and that's why it has the problem solving and form fit relationship we do. But then there's this other thing of once we accept that cultural selection can create form fit relationships, then we might be inferring, for lack of a better way of putting it, like genetic selection systems where in fact it's more cultural selection
Yeah.
systems. It's
Yeah.
when we know the clear distinction, like Christina always talks about, like reading, I think is a good example where, if we didn't know
Reading.
about the history of reading, we might think
It's a module.
it's a module. I mean, and maybe not. I don't know. Like, because the fact that not everybody learns to read, like, like any example has its issues. But I think that's a fair point, Christina. I want to make sure, like that. Like, is
And
that
I,
fair, Christina? Yeah.
yeah, and I think that, so I was trying to also, not to be like material versus social as like a clear distinction, but I think that the social world is fuller of that ambiguity. Like we don't know very
Yeah.
much about Paleolithic social life. It probably was super diverse. We don't know what it was like 2 million years ago, 3 million years ago. Like, forget it, right? And like to do a parallel to the reading example, like almost every society has marriage today. I know that there are exceptions.
Mm.
Um, and so we might infer that there's like a marriage-like modular world, like a cognition that really favors marriage when, we have good theoretical reasons to believe that that's probably a cultural institution. Like, yes, partly driven by like psychological motivations that are pan-human and so forth. But
Yeah.
I think it's a real challenge to disentangle those, and more so when we don't have like a good paleontology or archaeology to kind of help with our
Yeah.
intuitions about the
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. Yeah. The idea that our brain is just a shapeless mass with no predispositions, that's just obviously stupid. And you know, Steve Pinker's book, The Blank Slate. I mean, I know there are lots of social scientists who believe in the blank slate, but they're just not thinking hard about things. It can't be. It just, no matter what, it can't be, you know. And so it's always about how does it work exactly,
Yeah.
and or I completely agree with you, Christina. Maybe we're never going to get to exactly, but maybe a little bit of
Wonderful.
structure, and and so what I would say is questions are not about whether there's evolved stuff in the human brain that shapes the way we respond to cues in the environment. That's got to be right. But there are questions about, quantitative questions about where we sit on a kind of continuum. And my picture is, because we're predisposed strongly to think what people around us do must be sensible. Um, uh, uh, we get a lot of stuff from that, and if that's the way that EvPsych is going, I'm pleased. I mean, that's and there's going to be disagreements. We're scientists, right? That's the business we're in. But
And on the other side of things, coming from like what questions might have influenced cultural evolutionary theorists, coming from like the more cynical, like economist or psych side, do you think that there's been any shift in like thinking about what that credulity has to look like, or like what the limits of that credulity are?
yeah, it's a good question. Um, I mean, I think of it more. I mean, so I talked to Sarah Matthew quite a bit, and she and I differ about um, how likely it is that evolved motivations, I would call them, about kinship and stuff, structure cultural evolution. Um, and, she could be right. I mean, I could be right. These are things that we're going to learn, but I wouldn't say, I think of it as a bunch of specific stuff, not some general limitation
Mm-hmm.
about how credulous we are, but how strongly we're motivated by different kinds of things
Mm-hmm.
we experience in the environment to um, to think, well, no, yeah, uh, there's this XKCD cartoon that the mother is asking the kid, are the kid says, I'm, you're doing this just because all your friends are doing it. And the kid says, yeah, what would I always succumb to kin pressure. And the mother says, why would you do that? Suppose you were on a burning bridge. And the kid says, well, if 50 of my friends, well informed, jump off the bridge, who am I? What's the newspaper the next day going to say about the people who stayed on the bridge? But that depends on the cue. It depends on what inferences you can make from the environment. Maybe all those people were stupid. They jumped off the bridge, and you're the smart person who made the calculation to do it correctly.
Something that makes me super anxious about our enterprise here is that I think we can largely agree that they're about like certain basic motivations that we have,
Yeah,
right? Like motivation, like hunger is motivating,
yeah,
sex is motivating, so forth.
yeah,
And you might think on a good day, like, okay, we just need to find like the order in which like the algorithm that prioritizes some motivations or the other,
yeah.
including the motivation to conform to others, might be like, I think there might be a little bit of a debate about how much that's an
Oh, yeah, for sure.
intuitive
Yeah,
motivation just to
yeah,
conform to what
Yeah.
others do.
yeah,
Um, but on my nihilistic days, I think what's crazy is that those motivations themselves culturally evolve,
for
right?
sure.
So that
Yeah,
makes kind of coming up with like a
yeah. Well,
some
but look,
sort of
I mean,
clear algorithm.
Motivations to conform
you're
culturally
I
prone to
think
evolve?
these
so.
kinds of
And even for hunger, be motivated by hunger, right? Or like
yeah,
how much you should be motivated by
yeah, but you're
or
prone
how
to these
motivated you are.
depressive feelings, Christine. I've known you this long. Think of where we've come in the last 75 years, even 50 years.
So I wouldn't I
We're
wouldn't
much
frame
less confused now. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
David.
yeah, I wouldn't frame that as the motivation to conform evolving itself. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. What might make sense is that the costs of not conforming might vary from place to place.
Well, I think that
And the
there's
power
different
imbalances and
perspectives.
the alliance structure might be
Yeah,
such that
but
there are really powerful people who are really going to do bad things to you if you
yeah,
violate the norms. And in
that
some environments, the power structure is different and those costs aren't as high. But I wouldn't explain that as culture shaping the motivation to conform. I would just explain that in terms of,
yeah,
the mind making cost benefit calculations about what is going to be the
yeah,
likely course of action in this particular social context.
yeah. You're a real evolutionary psychologist. Uh, uh, I mean,
Guilty.
there's quite a
Christina,
bit
what's
of
yeah.
evidence that in other creatures that there's an innate conformist propensity. It's got nothing to do with norms or other people's punishments. Some evidence in people, it's somewhat conflicting, but models show that in the right kind of environment, having an intrinsic motive to conform can make you better off,
Yeah.
and in the fitness sense. And now it hangs on being hard to figure out what the right answer is.
Yeah.
And so, and I think, I mean, now this is, I won't live long enough to find out what the answer to this question is, but I think we are innately predisposed, or innately, we have, reliably developing, whatever you want to call it, propensity to obey social norms. We don't do we do calculations, but we don't need to. We all other things being equal, if
No.
the norm is to play the game a particular way.
Put lime in the corn. Put
Sure.
Yeah.
lime.
So,
Yeah.
these
Put lime.
experiments that Mike Tomasello has done, watch the videos. They
Sure.
teach some little German kid a new game, Daxing,
Mhm.
and then the kid learns how to play the game, and then they have a shill who then plays the game wrong. And
Yeah.
the kids, Nick, not Daxing, he says in German. He
Yeah.
gets really agitated.
That's his
Yeah.
verboten. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 And
Exactly.
I don't think evolutionary psychology. I I think our sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. There's morality, and we feel intrinsically motivated about moral violations. That's
Sure.
not, in my view. Now, this is a hypothesis, not a fact. Uh, a calculation based on the cost and benefits of powerful people. It's something we feel, and I can make models that show how such a thing could evolve. Doesn't mean evolve that way. Um, uh, And it again depends uh, on the difficulty of doing the calculations. Um, I think that one is one which we're going to make progress on, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah,
totally.
but
You may be right there, Rob. There may be a
yeah,
real disagreement here, but I want
yeah.
to push you and to acknowledge that maybe there is no disagreement. We're just talking past each other, because even your model of norms is built on the foundations of punishment. What a norm is something that people are punished for doing, and the non-punishers are punished, right? And so the idea of punishment, the infliction of costs, is built into the model.
That's
So,
built into the evolutionary model, not
right.
the contemporary why people do it model. So that explains why we have a norm psychology. Once you've got a norm psychology, the reason that you're outraged that, oh, when it was some outrage at the Olympics recently about some rule. But anyway, um, uh, or I mean, seriously,
But doesn't it presuppose that you have to know what's being punished and what's not
no,
being
no,
punished?
no, no. You just need to know what the norm is.
But how do you know what the norm is, if unless you're
because you
observing?
because people teach you, because you see what everybody
How are they
does.
teaching you though? Presumably they have to, threaten you with punishment
No,
or
no, no, no,
actually punish you,
no,
right?
no, no. So I don't even think you believe this. Um, uh, uh, so is it okay to beat your wife?
I mean, obviously not in
Well,
in
some
my
people think
culture.
it's fine.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
When we did this field work in Fiji, um,
Sure.
um, uh, Fijian norms have it that if you don't beat your wife when she's talks back or does some uppity thing, you're not just that you don't get what you want, you're a bad person.
Right.
And okay, so one of our field assistants was a married couple. And uh, the guy, you know, beat his wife pretty severely one night. So what do you do about that? You're living in a culture where that's the right thing to do. Uh, we told him he couldn't do it. So these moral beliefs, by the time you get to be my age,
Sure.
are
But
strongly held, and they've got nothing to do with the calculation of my long-term benefit.
I might disagree there. I mean, like, I think if you ask anyone, what will happen if you are seen as a domestic abuser, they will say that you will suffer horrible reputational consequences.
But
People
we took this guy who was our field assistant, and
yeah,
we paid a substantial cost to yell at him and tell him he couldn't do that in a culture where everybody thought what he was doing was fine.
I think
right.
there may
But
be three.
presumably, people understand that there are reputational costs for engaging in certain behaviors, and
But where was the
yeah,
reputational cost to me?
uh, I don't,
I mean,
presu
maybe to be super cynical, maybe,
yeah.
it was going to get back to your colleagues that you had a wife beater. All right.
Yeah, I mean that's the
But,
argument you'd have to make.
Yeah,
but can I
Yeah.
I
suggest that
don't
you
believe
use,
that argument.
Yeah.
I mean, to give you another example from my failed field work, um, uh, in Fiji, there's a very strong norm that women must be covered from head to toe in the village. And Fijian guys gossip endlessly about shoulders and ankles, they never see anything else. Young guys, that is. And so we spent 3 months in this village, and we went to to uh, we got a the village boat, took us several hours down the archipelago and dropped us at this beach where a tourist boat would come and pick us up. And so we're sitting on the beach having lunch, and a tourist walks by, a woman, and she's in a bikini. And I had this overwhelming, that woman needs to put some clothes on.
Mm.
She is not dressed properly. And
so there you did adapt to the local
I
circumstances more
did,
quickly.
absolutely. But I didn't realize that it adapted.
Hmm.
Mm.
It was, this is not science. This is,
Yeah.
I'm giving you
Anecdata.
a anecdata that living in a place where people thought it was wrong for women, and this is all brand new in Fiji. This is only 150 years old. Uh, um, and she was dressed completely fine by, we got on this boat and it's covered with college age tourists, all of them in bikinis. And in 45 minutes, I didn't feel that way anymore. But,
So
but
maybe this speaks to like three different time scales at least at which like things like punishment and I mean there's a
yeah,
whole debate about what kinds of social costs these are might
yeah,
be acting. So
mainly
it could
not
be
punishment, I think, mainly
like
loss of social
ostracism,
standing.
right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So these could be
Carr
Sure,
thinks
that's
kind of same.
a kind of cost. Yeah.
Well, but
so it could,
it's not costly punish. It doesn't cost.
right,
Right.
the
If you
punishment.
deprive people of costly services, you'd have to give them because they were good people,
Right.
then it actually pays you to punish them. But
Right.
So there are models that are like, this is about intergenerational evolutionary timescales that we're talking about, and this endowed us with some sort of like genetically evolved intuition for conforming to whatever we see other people around
right,
us to do in order to avoid those social costs. Then there's a possibility, and these are not mutually exclusive because it seems like even your experiences are at different timescales, right?
yeah,
So
two different time
two
scales.
different time
Yeah.
scales. Another one is that like you like currently there are institutions that ostracize you, punish you, whatever for not conforming. And so you learn about that early in childhood, let's say, and you kind of develop these internalized ideas about what is
Yeah,
morally right and
yeah,
wrong. And
yeah.
then like if the social environment changes for you like in adulthood, it's not going to change like those intuitions are going to change very
They're
quickly.
they're shallow. The
Yeah.
things. Yeah, I
But
think the only
I think
thing
there
I
is a third. There is a third, though, just to be complete. Like there is a
yeah
third possibility. I don't know if anybody believes this, but that it's like very much in the moment, right? That like the current incentive structures shape in the moment throughout your
yeah
life, like what is right and what is wrong. And I don't
yeah
know how credible
yeah.
that is,
It
but
could, I
yeah,
mean, these are questions, right? Good
yeah.
questions. Um, I mean, the only thing I would add to
Mm.
the is that
Yeah.
once you've internalized that beating your wife is wrong, then when you do the calculation about should I beat my wife, um, uh, I mean, on David's account, and I certainly think that's part of it, is I'm thinking about what'll happen to me if I get caught beating my wife. But I'm also have feelings that affect my trade-off that this is not the right thing to do. I get negative, you know, displeasure, whatever it is, because I grew up in a society, and so that changes the way I do the calculation, and um,
Yeah.
I so anyway. So,
Yeah, I think some of the issue too is I think with all of these conversations, one of the problems is the entire conversation we've had, natural selection or selective selection based thinking of cultural things. We lack a good not we don't have a natural vocabulary of what are the entities, right? Like, is it a piece of culture, design, a module? And now
yeah,
we're talking about sort of emotions, and there's sort of like
yeah,
cost
yeah,
benefit. There's a sense in which I can calculate the cost benefit. Like Rob, I think the other thing I do is I get really angry when people cross pedestrian no walks now after living in Germany. and
exactly.
that's, and that's like a very that's like
How
an
many times do you
incredibly
get yelled at in Germany
exactly
for
yes exactly.
violating some rule you didn't
Exactly,
know?
which I loved it actually. I was like dispositionally German, but anyway, um, but uh, uh, but then like there was another sense in which David, even the emotions, right? Like maybe the emotions baked into the emotions are cost benefit, but of course there's a difference between the kind of rational cost benefit that sort of like goal or planning systems are considering in this very short time scale versus maybe this longer time scale emotional systems. So I think in a lot of ways what typically is failing us is that there's just distinctions that are not made in the natural language that we all sort of have as organisms or just as cultural beings in the 21st century now.
Yeah,
And I
English
think,
speakers in the
yeah,
21st
exactly.
century.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, exactly. And that's, yeah, we had Clark on recently and he was making a point that, that's is also useful to talk to other people from different cultural backgrounds because they'll make different distinctions that we might be able to use, or at least see like our cultural bias. But I think, like for me at least, there's a sense in which all of these debates can be resolved, but they really hang on making more distinctions, and you can't start to make those more distinctions till you have the debates to begin with.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I
Mhm.
think um, we've made progress, so that's
Yeah,
good. And science is the series of hypotheses now refuted. And also, Max Planck said science
yeah,
progresses one funeral at a time. And I think there's some truth to that too.
yeah.
Um,
Rob, just to push on, like, I mean, for Pete's argument that it's sort of all very general, I mean, I think,
he
like,
no, he'll allow motivations, but
yeah,
no, there can be quite specific
yeah,
motivations, but there aren't any. I'm not actually sure how he
right.
parses this out, but uh, there's
Is
nothing in there that tells you um, and what would be a good example. I mean, obviously technological examples. There's nothing where
right.
like bird's nests,
Yeah,
and
So maybe like no
you know,
propensities to think about taxonomic categories in a
yeah,
certain
exactly. That'd be a good one.
yeah,
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 that we aren't innately Linnaean in our taxonomic
right.
way of thinking, and I think the evidence is pretty good we aren't. The Fijians put dolphins and fish in the same category, but
Yeah.
uh,
So does my
and
son. Yeah.
yeah, and they don't, and so they don't have any animals they care about. They're pigs and chickens, and
Yeah.
and they just don't think about vertebrates very much. But I mean,
Yeah.
land vertebrates. But anyway,
Yeah. But do you think, I mean, I do I mean, like I think we all do this. And I think this is something I learned from Christina, which is this notion of you make the tentative, almost like a gambit or like a assumption that's helpful for your own carving up the world, right? So like as a John and Lita adaptationist, I don't want to study the complexities of like developmental programs or like genetic pleiotropy. Like I want to
yeah,
assume that away. And so
yeah,
I do. And there's an argument in the sense which like that's fair of me because of what I'm studying. Somebody else later, even though I'm wrong about saying it doesn't matter, if I say that it does matter, I can assume it away because for what the slice of the world is that I'm studying, I have to assume it away at least for now. Does is Pete what is Pete
he's
assuming?
100% with that. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, we
yeah,
think of ourselves as full adaptationists,
yeah,
and but we just see the adaptive problem as different than
right.
I see it differently than maybe John and Lita did, and in Nabajin Salon we have this example of the avocado slicer that uh, I was the adaptationist paradigm is it's not a paradigm, it's a heuristic, and it is an extremely powerful heuristic, which sometimes leads you astray, and and depends on a bunch of ancillary
Mm,
hypotheses about trade-offs and costs and benefits and a bunch of other stuff,
yeah,
uh, and I have no time whatsoever for Gouldian or the guy that studied Tiktaalik, this fish. He's a big believer in developmental constraints. I don't think they're constraints. I think there are developmental pathways that affect the patterns of variation
yeah.
that do exist now and that will exist in the future if we make some changes. And they're obviously important. And the extent that they're important, they make the adaptationist paradigm, um, hard to do, right? Because if you don't know what those developmental, um, you're not
Right? So
constrained.
is this I'm missing something
Yeah,
about
this
why you wouldn't
the
call this
yeah.
a constraint,
Um,
like a pathway versus a constraint.
um, maybe it comes from my background is I did for 3 years, did optimization mathematics as a, to design things like power plant systems and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a constraint is a relationship between variables that you're trying to adjust that is fixed.
Mm-hmm.
So either, temperature is related to volume and there's a curve, and then you have to travel along that curve, or there's a constraint, something can't be greater than less than 0, say, or something like that.
Right. If you make the smokestack higher with less concrete, it would be better, but it's not going to stay up. And so
There
that's
is
a
no
constraint.
smokestack. Yeah,
Yes.
it's a
Yeah.
constraint.
Yeah.
And I think most of the things we see in biology are things that shape the patterns of variation that selection can work on. They don't say it can't go there,
I see.
but they affect
Right.
the likelihood that new variants
Right.
are produced. And so sometimes it can be absolutely crucial, So do you guys know the Lenski experiments with E. coli?
Right, yeah,
So,
like lots of
Oh,
different
yeah.
evolutionary trajectories, right?
yeah. So Lenski did experiments. I think he's got 14 replicants now, 65,000 plus generations in the same. It puts them in a new environment, 65,000 generations ago, and watches what happens. At first, they diverge. Some of them they go in the same average direction. They get bigger. The individual E. coli get bigger. They do a bunch of other things, but some lines are doing better than other lines. So, and he can prove this because he's got them in the freezer. He's got fossil E. coli in the freezer, and he creates competition experiments between 1,000 generations ago and now. And sure enough, the new ones always beat the old ones. Okay, so this is all great. And then after 20 or 30,000 generations, a lot of that variation disappears. And they are all pretty much on the same, not quite, but almost on the same trajectory. And now these are not eukaryotes, right? So they don't have full-blown recombination. They have some recombination, but so it takes a while. My picture of this and his picture is that it takes a while for, the order in which mutations occur matters, right? Both because mutations potentiate other mutations and all this kind of stuff. But then at like 50,000, I don't know the exact number, but at about 50,000 generations, all of a sudden, one of the lines just beats the crap out of everybody else. So the typical, how this experiment works, he puts in some glucose in the morning, the population expands to carrying capacity, then they shut down. The next morning he gives them more glucose, and that goes on for 40,000 generations, and they get better at that environment. Now, there's citrate in the medium, and it's very well known in E. coli biology that E. coli cannot digest citrate in the presence of oxygen. The enzyme that's necessary to do the job is inactivated in the presence of oxygen. This is something that people who do, it was thought to be true of all E. coli, but not at 50,000 generations. A series of neutral mutations had occurred, and then eventually, and those are all improbable that they drift to high enough frequency, and then a new mutation that coupled with those neutral ones allowed the E. coli to digest citrate in the presence of oxygen. And all of a sudden, all bets are off. It completely annihilated the previous 50,000 generations. In humans, that goes back, to the Mesozoic practically, right? I don't know exactly how far, but 60,000 times 10 is 600,000 600,000 years. Yeah, so it doesn't go back to the Mesozoic, but it goes back well before people. And so there is this kind of stuff. You would never have predicted that on an adaptationist program if you took this species-specific property of E. coli, namely, they can't digest citrate in the presence of oxygen. as a constraint, right? And it wasn't a constraint. There just wasn't any variation in the necessary
Mhm.
genes, which gave rise to the necessary phenotypic variation for that to happen. And the series of mutations and events, namely drift, that had to occur for that to happen are very improbable. So, I think, you know,
Does
the
this give,
adaptationist hypothesis is extremely powerful, but sometimes it gets you the wrong answer. Yeah.
so what do you make of some people are really kind of concerned about making equilibrium type arguments, which is kind of maybe another version of the phenotypic gambit. I don't know. Just that even if we're adaptations, like the world is constantly changing and no
Yeah.
time more than today, does this
Yeah.
I think Pete has actually made some arguments to this effect, and some of his students that like equilibrium thinking is just at odds with what we know about the human experience, that
Yeah.
we've
I think,
never been at
uh,
equilibrium. Does this
uh,
give us pause for making adaptationist kinds of,
well, we should think about the time scale on which
yeah.
variation takes place. And I know Pete knows all about this, but he likes to argue. I have not argued with Pete about this particular item.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, there's variation on all kinds of time scales, right?
Yeah.
Um, and on some time scales, I think, that technically, so if we have variation on, say we have an organism that has a 1 year generation time, and we have temporal variation on 100-year time scales, um, it's never going to reach an equilibrium,
Yeah.
but uh, there'll be a stationary
Right.
distribution of types, right? And it'll respond to some temporal average or in spatial, it's all these averages in population genetics. I think that's clearly of great importance to get the right time scale on which you think adaptation is responding. But it's not an in principle thing. It's just one of the things you have to take into account when it's there are trade-offs, right? And
If only we knew.
well, I think, yeah,
Hmm.
I'm more of an optimist than you are,
I guess.
Christina.
Yeah.
uh, you
Yeah. And I
know,
think, yeah.
I think so. Pete and I have argued that agriculture didn't evolve during the Pleistocene not because you couldn't grow plants, because wheat was growing somewhere for sure. It didn't just appear magically 10,000 years ago, um, uh, but because the timescale of fluctuations during the last glacial was too short for the and we would support that with. So if you look at the spread of agriculture across the world, agriculture didn't spread, agriculturalists spread. So and so populations which already had the norms, women's roles, you have to be willing. When you're an agriculturalist, you've got to be able to save stuff, and so sharing norms have to change. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to change. And our argument would be that that doesn't change on 500-year timescales. And you know, now that might be wrong. I have to say, archaeologists haven't taken it very seriously, but that's a case where our picture of the temporal scale on which norms evolve is related to the temporal scale on which the environment's evolving. And if I mean, I could go on and on, but the environmental variation in the Pleistocene was staggering
Mhm.
compared to the Holocene. I mean, um, you could be a hunter-gatherer living in what would be now the south coast of France, and 500 years later, you're living in northern Norway, someplace, without having moved at all. That was the scale and the amplitude and time scale and now the Holocene is this happy, warm, stable world, and I really think we really ought to think about that. And uh, Eric Smith thinks. So Pete and I published this paper. This shows you, how you get hoisted on your own petard. We published this paper a couple of years ago about large-scale cooperation in Holocene hunter-gatherers that I would argue shows there's plenty of large-scale cooperation and we argue, see, these ethnographic studies of the Kung and the Hadza and so on are not good models for the Pleistocene. If you think about Pleistocene cooperation, you should think about large-scale cooperation amongst non-relatives. And Eric said, "Oh yeah, but Pleistocene climate variation was so great that the social institutions necessary to support large-scale cooperation couldn't have evolved, so they were just like the Hadza." And I thought that was mean.
Yeah.
But
Full circle. Yeah.
As Leafy cited you, right?
he was one of the reviewers. That's
Yeah.
how I know. It wasn't that he
Mm,
wrote a paper about this. It's
Okay.
that
that's funny.
so we quoted him in the paper and
Yeah.
we got permission to use his name because Eric is a very smart guy and thoughtful. But yeah,
Rob, this is a slight change of or topic, just methodological for a second. I know, what is your opinion about sort of computer technology? Because a lot of the stuff we're talking about is also like you can do, if you understand the concepts, you can do the math, but then there's also a lot of computational modeling of things. Do you view the sort of analytic or, math thinking about ESSs versus modeling and simulations?
yeah.
Do you view that as still separate? And is there a cost of losing the first to the second with all the technology? Or what's your take on that?
Uh,
You
I,
know?
I I think they've always been complementary.
Yeah.
I think they're the cheapness and speed of computing has made agent-based simulations better and more practical. I think that agent-based simulations, there's a temptation to over-specify that because it's easy, people have a tendency to build what they think of as realism into the models, and all models are wrong, some are useful. That's a famous aphorism. Um, and I think that done right, analytic models and computer simulations should be used together to understand things, especially things where random factors are important, like climate change or small population effects or any of those things. Uh, uh, I will say that for kind of sociological reasons, I think, or maybe cultural evolutionary reasons, um, when I publish an analytical result, I put nowadays, I didn't used to, but all the math is in the what do they call that?
Yeah, the
The
supplementary or
supplementary
appendix. Yeah,
material,
yeah,
but
yeah,
somebody can follow it.
yeah.
That's not true. There's no, people always say I put my code
Right.
the supplementary, but it might as well be on the moon because we don't have any conventions about how to and I will tell you a story. I like stories, but Herb Gintis and I, this 2001 paper that's been cited more than any other paper I've ever written, and I actually think is maybe not such a great paper, where we looked at cultural group selection. Um, uh, well, the details are important, but for reasons I don't really remember, Herb and I decided to do um, clean room simulations. So we both wrote simulations. We clearly specified what the model should be like. And then we wrote the simulations and they did completely different things. And it took us a month of hard work to find out where they diverged and why they diverged. And it was all stupid reasons. None of it was conceptual. And nobody does that, right? The only people who do that are people writing programs to fly airplanes and stuff
Right.
like that.
Right.
And I think this is a big problem, actually, that the reliability of analytical stuff is better than the
Yeah.
reliability of simulations, because I write simulations, and I've never done that since. It took
Yeah.
and so I don't know how we're going to solve that, but we will. I think we'll come up with, and it's going to make simulations a lot harder. I
Mm.
think to make sure they're right. And um,
You might be
but
able to ask AI today, what's the difference
Yeah,
between
I
yours
know.
and Herb's code?
Maybe, yeah.
maybe I ask AI to look at. I've been doing some simulations. So Moshe and I, you remember those conversations we had? Moshe and I got in this argument about um, uh, the paper that Minois and I and Chris and about continuous norms. And so Moshe said, well, blah, blah, blah. And I couldn't, the program that Minois had written couldn't be modified very easily to address Moshe's question. So I rewrote an agent-based model, which fortunately produced the same results that Minois produced, and was way faster. And so I'd force Minois to do all this work because I thought the other way would be faster. Anyway, and so then I thought, well, I should ask ChatGPT to look at this code, and and it had all kinds of stupid suggestions. So this was now, how long ago was it that we were arguing with Moshe? 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. 2 years ago, yeah. And it may be that it's a lot better. I mean, they're making, and I know that from my daughter that it is getting better. So maybe it would work now. But then it just had, I thought,
Oh,
it made a bunch of suggestions that would have made the code 5% faster and 1,000% harder to understand what it did.
right.
And so anyway,
Yeah.
that's my anecdote about ChatGPT.
It has
Do you
no
think,
conceptual understanding. Yeah.
just do you
Well,
think that,
yeah, it doesn't. At least then, it didn't care about how expressive the code was.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
do you think we ought to be using more just basic analytic models, basic algebra relative to agent-based simulations? Is that part of the,
Uh,
the argument you're making, that way of thinking is kind of underplayed?
it's harder, and I think, yeah, I do think it's not enough of it being done. And I think part of the problem is, I mean, this is another cultural evolutionary thing. is The people who do it, analytical work, are mainly physicists and mathematicians that are looking for another job. And they place a big store on the, my equations are longer than your equations kind of
Mhm.
competition. And so this is really clear in reciprocity theory. So um, Sarah and I have just written a review of reciprocity theory for
Mm.
ticks. And I would say since 2005, maybe somewhere in there, 95% of modeling and reciprocity is responding to previous models of reciprocity. And almost none of it is in response to questions about observed behavior. And that's because I work with a mathematician, Roberto Schoenmann, who is a wonderful person and a good colleague, but too sensitive to work in the evolutionary biology world. He quit because we were so mean. Reviewers were so mean. Anyway, he said, to be a successful mathematician, you have to find a problem that is not too easy, so anybody could do it, and not so hard, so you can't do it. But this sweet spot in between is something you can make progress on. There's a lot of interesting developments. And that's what reciprocity theory is. It's a really nice problem, a lot of possibilities, and I think mainly a waste of time.
Mm.
Uh, um, and this is where I'm going to, with few friends I have left in that field, I'm not going to have any more after we publish this paper. But that's why John Maynard Smith is my intellectual hero.
Yeah. All
He
the
never did
big,
anything complicated.
yeah. Look
It,
at the classic, Hamilton's rule, the classic
yeah.
Trivers paper. This is just
Well,
basic
Trivers paper
algebra.
really has no math in it, but
There's a little bit of it, but yeah, I take your
well,
point. Yeah.
he says Bill Hamilton told me that you could represent this as a prisoner's dilemma, and here's what Hamilton said. I just,
Yeah.
I've read that paper recently, so
Yeah.
it's easy for me to be an
Yeah.
expert here. But uh, and that paper is full of bad confusions, the Trivers paper. But he well, I won't go into that. But
We
he's
could
one
have
of
a
our
2 hour. We should have a 2 hour episode about Trivers.
he's one
I
of
would love that.
our
Yeah.
powerful ancestors, but he's not a clear thinker. He's a extremely brilliant, intuitive thinker, but you got to check, right? I mean, um, the key is to find simple enough representations of some problem that you can make analytical progress. And there are some problems you just can't do that way. I mean,
Yeah.
Anything involving random drift-like features. I mean, there is analytical stuff, but it's hopelessly complicated and it can't do anything. Well, there's lots of interesting stuff it can't do very easily. Any model in which selection varies in time or space, and it isn't white, so that there's any correlations in time and space, there's no analytical method to deal with that. That's completely opaque to analytical approaches, and it's quite easy to deal with. John Gillespie did a lot of work on that, and that's obviously a question of importance. So we ought to do a lot of simulations. But if we can do the analytical stuff, it's very powerful. It gives you intuitions that are hard to get out of the simulations. You can get them, but it's harder because the equations talk to you. When you look at the equations, they tell you things without actually having to solve them. And as yet, I think we'll fix this, but as yet, our simulation tools don't do this. I've been working with a couple of Spaniards, economists, who do simulations of repeated prisoner's dilemma, of all things, that I just got done criticizing. And they use this thing that's often thought of as kind of a child's play programming language, NetLogo. And I'm really impressed to the extent to which they're able to get intuitions out of the way, how easy it is. It's very slow and a kind of stupid language and as a computer science kind of project, but in terms of teaching you stuff, I'm very impressed. I'm going to try to learn it. And anyway, so I think this is technological, a lot of it. We haven't been doing it long enough to be good at it. And the agent-based simulations, that is.
But the idea is that the analysis so far, or the formulas are, you're forced to know what the concepts and the relationships in a way that you could sort of be agnostic about in a simulation. Like you might run a simulation where like, well, yeah, I don't know what the relationship is. I just know I got an outcome. And I don't really know what all the things that I fit into
No,
it, what mattered or didn't. It's just in compared to the analysis or the formula or the analytic math, you have to know what the entity is and what the relationships are, or otherwise you're not able to
no,
do it.
I disagree with that.
Okay, yeah, please.
I think the agent-based simulation. So in an analytical model, typically you've got a bunch of state variables, frequencies of genes or whatever it is. And you write down a dynamical system in which you posit relationships based on some, in my way of thinking, and Cristina was forced to go through all this in my class, you write down a life cycle and you ask what happens to individuals, and then you use law of large numbers to then ask to create relationships for the state variables. I think agent-based simulations are exactly the same in the
Mm.
sense you have to write down a life cycle. You have to write down state variables, but now the state variables aren't these aggregate ones. They're ones at the individual level, what it
Mm.
knows, how big it is, whatever it is. And so your space of possibilities is much bigger.
Mm.
But I think at least the way I think about things, uh, uh, there's a quantitative difference between them, but conceptually, they're exactly the same. There's nothing, you have to specify ahead of time what the possibilities are. You can't have unknown. And there was a physicist at SFI when I was there who went on and on about what was wrong with evolutionary theory is that it specified the possibilities in advance, and evolution really didn't do that. It could go, and I think this is really an argument about how big the space is. And
Mm.
if the space gets big enough, then um,
I
it,
think that lends itself to, I think I have seen agent-based models that don't give a good intuition at the end, even in the article of
you
like
have
why,
or
yeah,
haven't.
I have seen articles where they
Yeah,
don't give a
yeah,
good
yeah.
intuition of why it resulted the way
Yes,
that they
yeah.
did. And I do think that's rare in analytical models because I mean I think it could still happen
It
because you
happens,
could
but I agree, it's much rarer.
there's
Yeah,
like because part of the process of publishing the analytical model is like walking you through why the next thing
right. And,
So
and,
it's easier
and
to
also the
recover.
analytical model, because the internal works of the simulation model aren't visible to you in the
Right.
same way.
right,
It's much harder to figure out what's
why,
happening.
right.
And I think we need to do, I mean, we need to do a lot more of experimentation with agent-based models. Go in and do
Yeah,
experiments,
yeah, right.
look at intermediate values,
Yeah.
and my bet is that over time, referees and the scientific process will force people to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Now I teach a version of that class, Rob, to
Oh, do
grad
you?
students,
Do
but
you?
but I think that most of them don't want to be modelers, and so a lot of the time is spent just like so their final project is reading a model and making sure that they can understand why the
Yeah,
results are the way that they are.
yeah,
It could be a simulation, it could be a
yeah,
mathematical one, because that's what I think a lot of us, well, a lot of the evolutionary social scientists who are not going to be modelers themselves still need that practice to be able to read that
yeah,
literature
yeah, yeah,
understand why the results turn out that way,
yeah,
as opposed to take it for granted that there's going to be this
yeah,
relationship. I
yeah,
think that's actually led to a lot of confusion or taking at face value kind of conclusions
yeah,
without
yeah.
thinking about the conditions under which or the assumptions that allow those patterns to
Yeah,
arise.
I think that, I mean, this is a problem with not just evolutionary social science, but evolutionary biology more
Mm,
generally, is that um, it's not a norm that um, practitioners understand the mathematical theory.
mm,
And it's not a norm that mathematical theorists are well versed in the empirical
mm,
facts. And I mean, so if you interact with physicists, or to a lesser extent with economists, every empiricist knows the theory at least at some level. I mean, really knows it in a substantial way. And in economics, now economics has become very empirical. I mean,
mm,
much more than it used to be. And and it's deeply rooted in game theory. Now, my own personal opinion is most of it is kind of crazy, that it is not very well coupled to anything about real humans, the game theory that, but anyway, be that as it may, when you talk to economists and they're talking about I go 3 times a year to this group of, listen, I'm part of this network, which has got, Acemoglu and Robinson and Meyerson and all these Nobel Prize winning economists and various students and stuff. And they really understand exactly how the models work, what they say, and they're not doing modeling themselves at all. the
Mhm.
people that I'm listening to. They're doing, mainly these big regression kinds of studies. And so that's their version of empiricism. Um, and it is, and then if you listen to biologists, let's forget about evolutionary cell, but they kind of pick and choose theory the way they want. They don't really understand the models that well. This obviously varies from person to person, but um, I think, it's because when you teach this course, you can be nobody's requiring this course. Whereas if you're in physics or economics, you take a year in graduate school where they teach you all the same stuff you learned in undergraduate school all over again, you know, theory of the firm, game theory, all this stuff. So they really got it deep. And, I think what a biologist would say, that's all a waste of time. We don't have enough theory to make that worthwhile. And I think there's some truth to that because the system hasn't developed so that the theory and the empiricism is inextricably linked together. And,
Mm.
um,
So you
so,
think it's better integrated in economics,
oh
the
yeah, much better.
but like so but is it inherent to the body of theory that they've developed that
No, it's
it's just a
cultural
sociological
evolutionary.
phenomenon? Yeah, right.
It has to do with the way the institution evolved.
Right.
Mm.
Um, it was so theoretical when I took graduate economics in 1971. There was hardly any. I mean, empiricism was kind of like biology, this casual empiricism. And then in the 90s and not, economics did this big shift to, so now hardly anybody gets a PhD doing theory. The way you get a PhD is it's like a biologist. You find some system that allows you to test something, but you do that you're absolutely deeply knowledgeable about game theory, but not game theory the way we do it, game theory the way economists do it, which I think is, well, you don't care what I think about it, but it's kind of, yeah, it's, you know, wacky basically. I shouldn't say that on a
It's a
podcast,
technical term. Yeah.
I mean, their equilibrium concepts are not evolutionary. They're about you think that I think that you think that I think,
Mm.
and they're deeply committed to those. And if I go to these meetings and I voice mild skepticism in people, and they're very, very ethnocentric about economics. They don't think the rest of the social sciences is worth listening to, except history, maybe, hardly at all.
Mm.
And but I figure I'm doing missionary work,
Yeah.
and
Fighting the good fight. Yeah.
you know, missionaries end up in the stew pot sometimes. But
Uh, yeah, but I think the connection, I mean, theory, I think theory because we're wrapping up here, theory and empirics, I think is a theme of sort of Rob, your contribution. And I think all the evolutionary sciences is that we've sort of, for a while there was a lot of theory, not a lot of empirical work. Maybe we've swung to there's lots of empirical work, but not enough
oh,
theory. But I don't, I mean, I think, I'm at least heartened that we compared to a lot of human psychology, for example, and I mean, I'm speaking as a psychologist.
yeah, yeah,
There's a lot more theory we have at our
yeah,
disposal as
yeah, yeah, yeah,
evolutionists than
yeah.
a lot of psychologists per se.
Yeah, I mean, Joe and Michael have written this paper about that,
Yeah.
and when I interact with the social psychologists here, Doug Kenrick and yeah, oh gosh, anyway,
Steve Newberg,
and
yeah.
Steve Newberg,
Yeah.
yeah, really smart, accomplished people,
Yeah.
but they would do better if they had more theory, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. Yeah. Different histories. Yeah. Different. So
Yeah,
as you said,
exactly.
different
Different institutions.
different institutional
Yeah,
selection, different
yeah,
histories.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Christina, do you have any final questions?
Oh, that's a really tough spot to put me.
Yeah. I mean, we can
I
always ask Rob if we should have asked him anything. That
I
also is
oh,
a
that's
tough we
always a
put
good
there.
one. I wanted to ask if there's anything that you've changed your mind about, like over the
Mm.
last several decades.
Um,
Maybe based on the empirics or maybe better
yeah,
theorized.
I used to be more gung-ho about cultural group selection than I am now. I'm more aware of the empirical. I mean, a lot of the criticism of cultural group selection has kind of been, in principle, group selection can't work, and that's wrong, right, for sure. But the problem is well, first of all, I worry a lot. I have been worried ever since 1985 about how fast it is and can it explain enough. There's a lot of norms we got evolved, and is there enough cultural group selection? And I worry about that actually. And I've come to think that within group processes uh, have got to be more important, both based on that and based on lots of empirical examples, which just there's no group selection involved, and yet there's lots of change. Um, uh, I am bothered by the fact that I can't think of a good theory. I think the bargaining theories don't make sense because, or at least they can't explain the variation we see because the scale on which, I mean, small scale people can bargain on the scale of a few thousand people maybe, and we see norms on the scale of continents. And so there has to be something else that causes successful norms to spread from one group to another. It can't all be within group bargaining. And I've got some ideas about that, and Sarah has got some ideas about that. And I'm less convinced about conformism than I used to be as a learning strategy.
Is that because there are better ones out? Like basically we usually
No,
have a
just
better
because
option or
because the data are ambiguous, is what I would say,
okay.
mixed. The data for other animals,
Seem
surprisingly,
stronger.
are much stronger. Yeah. So these wonderful experiments that Lucy Applin has done on bird learning are, they are conformists for sure. And interestingly, so so a kind of psychology you might think, well, the number of instances is what people would respond to, but the theory tells you it's the number of individuals, not the number of instances, because that's what generates adaptive information. And sure enough, those birds don't care about instances; they care about the number of individuals.
Can
And
I put a pause and just say something that is like common knowledge according to like the rest of the social sciences, which
yeah,
is if you repeat something more, people will believe it.
yeah,
And that doesn't make sense to me.
no,
Like
No,
why,
no,
yeah.
but what
yeah,
are the what
but
is
I
on
don't think
the
they've.
theoretical side, but is the empirical side true
No,
Uh,
on?
as far as I'm aware, at least in humans, the empirical side hasn't been holding up on that.
Okay.
this is
I forget what they
science,
call it.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah,
uh, I think they need a theory to tell them what
Why that was right.
yeah,
what kinds of repeats are important,
Right.
and repeats across individuals
Right.
are important.
yeah.
Repeats within individuals will matter in an environment which is changing on timescales that
Hmm.
are fast enough. But anyway, so what else have I changed my mind about?
And just to be clear, the slight increased skepticism about cultural group selection is just that it doesn't account for as many norm changes as you might have thought that they did because the change is happening too quickly. Culture change is happening too quickly relative
Too
to like the
quickly, and so the shift in norms about tobacco smoking in the
right,
U.S. No
right,
group selection there.
right.
There, it's
There weren't like
and
migrants to like the no smoking
Yeah.
zones.
right, right.
Right.
It's not that.
Yeah.
Um, and Now, well, I don't want to go into all the details, but this is an area which I thought when I first started, I thought I had the answer. Now I think it's part of the answer. How big a part? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, Joe gets really mad when I say that, but at least I think he does. I mean, it could be faster. Well, you don't want to hear all this.
It might have mattered more historically than it does now, like when there was so much,
Lots
war
of
between
cultural
groups.
variation.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think the main form is going to be differential spread.
yeah,
So groups imitating successful other group, individuals imitating people and successful neighbors. But I still don't think that explains a lot of stuff. And I don't know. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head. I've been right about so many things.
Yeah, that's the problem. You can't show that you're a good scientist if you're just right all the
I
long.
have to think of something.
Yeah. But I do think, I mean, Rob, just to say, like, as we're closing up too, like, I do appreciate that, as a student of John Alita's, like, you've been very gracious over the years. And I think talking about the evolved psychology explicitly, and I do think that you are part of the reason why for people like Christina and David, that the gap between sort of cultural evolution and ev psych, at least in principle, and maybe a lot of times in practice, is very narrow. And nowadays, I don't even think most people don't even, I don't know. I mean, in my experience, it's more in Christina language, sort of people's emphasis in terms of their methods, less than their sort of deep commitments. Where I think somebody who's an evolutionary psychologist is like, yeah, there's cultural evolution, and somebody who's a cultural evolutionist is like, oh yeah, there's evolved psychology. I may not use it in my model, but that
I unfortunately have another thing
go.
that I need to get to.
But yeah, it was just great. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Christina.
Sure. My pleasure.
This was a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you.
You never know what to say for the outro.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, this was great. Everybody have a good week. Do the usual Patreon,
Patreon, social media, kind review. You know the drill.
Yep. We should get t-shirts, David.
T-shirts, fanny packs.
Can I say our logo? I don't love our logo in terms
Really?
of like, I like our logo for the purposes of a podcast, but I don't know if I would want the brain on a shirt for me. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have any aesthetic taste or fashion sensibility.
Here's my vision of a t-shirt. A black t-shirt that says nothing except the podcast in parentheses.
Oh, like kind of a minimalist direction.
Yeah, it's like you got to be on the end. It's sort of like, Banksy.
Sort of small Dino in covert signal.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe that's what we'll do.
All right. Yeah. Cool. Well, we can't do it unless you support us.
Yeah.
And maybe give us some money on Patreon for the t-shirts.
If you run a t-shirt concern and have the ability to silk screen, however many of those, let us know.
Yeah. Totally.
Okay.
All right. See you next week.
Bye. Have a good week, everybody.